Once we have a good sense of what we need in terms of the demand for employees with particular skill sets, we've got to then look at the labor supply. We have to know what we have inside our organization, which is in our internal labor market, and we have to know what's available in the external labor market and be able to make a really good assessment of that. So that's the next step of this process, is figuring out how do we assess what is available to us, and then developing a plan, of course, how to reach them or prepare our internal candidates for those promotions. And so again, when we recognize that there is a mismatch between what we need and what we have, we need to figure out whether there are promotional opportunities or developmental opportunities for people internally, and also identifying externally where we can find the hires with the skill sets that we need to meet our demand. While forecasting in the internal labor market may seem like the easier option, it actually is more complicated than simply looking at the skill sets of people and whether or not they're available for promotion. Not everybody wants to be promoted, and we also need to look at the historical flows of people through the organization. This is where we use a Markovian analysis to really get a sense of um, what are some potential losses that we can expect in terms of predicting our turnover rates. For example, if people get promoted, as you know, that creates vacancies in the lower levels. If people get demoted, the same thing occurs. We have more vacancies in the upper level, and we have then positions filled in the lower level. If people transfer from one department to another, we have a gain in one department or a gain in one branch, but we have a loss in another branch. And so we've got to consider refilling those. Retirements, of course, people leave, and those are things we can't control, right? We cannot control whether or not someone's ready to retire unless we're offering an early retirement program. And even then, you can't force people to early retire. You can certainly suggest it, but you can't force them to do that because that would be discriminatory under the ADEA. People resign for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are controllable reasons and some of them are non-controllable reasons. So it is important that we recognize, on average, what is our normal average turnover rate due to resignations versus promotions, demotions, transfers, and retirements. And we try to put this in a flow diagram and in a transition matrix or a Markovian analysis for us to be able to see how people proceed from through those positions. One of the biggest challenges we have, of course, with these kind of analyses is that it just assumes people move once within the transition period, and that's not necessarily true. You could have someone that gets demoted and then leaves the company, so you've got two transitions there. You've got a person who gets demoted from one position to another, and then you have them resigning. So they could have two moves within one period, and that's a concern for planning purposes. So these transition analyses are good and they're helpful at one level, but they are not the be all and end all. When we have to find a way to account for these multiple levels of transitions that we might see in the company. A transition analysis is really useful for us, as I've said, because it gives us a quantitative tool to use how to analyze our internal labor market. And so that, again, it has its limitations because it doesn't account for multiple transitions within a time period, but generally speaking, it gives us a really strong rule of thumb with historical data over time so that we can get a better sense of what percentages of people move in particular directions. And then we can, if we don't feel like there's enough promotions, we can increase our promotions and think about how to change our HR system to increase promotions or to increase the development of people so they're ready for promotions, or think about what we need to do to actually retain our employees so that we don't have problems with people who exit the organization prematurely. It is a simple technique, as I said, with its own limitations, but it really it helps employees to also understand where can they go in the company if they're sort of done with the job that they're in. And that happens to people all the time. There are times when someone has done a more advanced job and they just don't want the responsibility and the pressure anymore. And so they're perfectly happy doing a lower level job, the next level down, and just, instead of managing people, just doing the tasks that they need to do. Oftentimes, though, some people, are forced to demote when they don't necessarily like it. So if people don't recognize that they can be promoted or demoted or even transfer from one department or one division to another, this transition matrix is a good, useful tool for us to have conversations with our employees about the kinds of transition opportunities there are for them in the company. We can also forecast the number of people who currently work for the organization who are likely to still be employed sometime in the future. So when we are trying to market ourselves as an employer of choice, for example, we might say that our turnover rate is really low. We have very few people who transition away from the company. Most of our people move up and get promoted in the company. So there's all sorts of things that we can use this to help us with the way that we brand ourselves as an employer of choice. And again, we want to make sure when we're doing this analysis is not making it more complex than it needs to be, but actually keeping it pretty simple with the key positions. Like I can do a transition analysis for, in our churns case, do a position analysis for a sales associate. So how many of them get promoted to the next level? How many of them jump up 2 levels if it's possible? It's rare, but it's possible. How many of them get demoted? And probably for a sales associate, there is no demotion situation, but there is for department managers or store managers. They could be demoted. And how many of them leave or how many of them retire. And so as you get into your churns case, you'll see quite a bit of that in your in your exercise for forecasting. Figure 5.4 in the textbook, which is illustrated here, is a great visual of how people can transition through an organization. So you might have a target position. Let's say, if we're going to use the churns case as our example, you've got department managers, right? And so what positions would normally get promoted into a department manager position? So there may be one position, there may be multiple positions that we need to consider. In churns, it's fairly simplified. It's, you've got sales associate, department manager, store manager, right? But there may be more complex organizations that have, for example, the head of recruiting could be the feeder positions for the head of recruiting could be the person who sources and the person who does legal. So it could be somebody who does training that could transition to be the head of recruitment too. So it isn't always the direct line of succession. There could be indirect lines of succession. When we're doing internal labor markets, just because there is only one subordinate position in the direct line of succession doesn't necessarily mean that's the only opportunity for people to get promoted to a department manager or a functional manager, right? Sometimes you can get people from different functional areas who have some basic skills, who have maybe moved laterally for a while. Now they may want to move into a higher level managerial position. And the whole goal of HR management, for example, is to have broader skills, right? You're not just skilled in one area. You want to have a generalist perspective and recognize that just because you're an expert in staffing doesn't mean you couldn't do training or doesn't mean you couldn't do compensation, that you should be able to understand all the functional areas of HR and be able to transition through the HR function, perhaps in not always the best linear manner. But anyway, getting back to this, feeder position 1 and feeder position 2, whether they are in the direct line of succession or the indirect line through some lateral transfers, across different functions, you can move up to the target position. And even from that target position, you could be promoted up one layer. So a person in that target position, for example, the department manager at Churns could be promoted to store manager. They could also exit the company by leaving for any number of reasons. A new job opportunity, they could retire, they could leave because they're unhappy with the company, any number of reasons. Then you could do a lateral transfer or move, again, from one target position to a different target position that may have some comparable skills, even if it's not in direct line of succession for promotion, in the corporate hierarchy. So you could actually make a lateral move to have a job with similar responsibilities, but in a different area, right? So you might go from sales to loss prevention. You could always do that. Lastly, you have the demotions where someone is not doing well or someone chooses to be demoted because they don't want the responsibility of the job anymore. They can be demoted out, and so they can go down to a lower level. And sometimes that does happen for a whole host of reasons. The next two slides demonstrate how you can take that flow that we just talked about in the previous slide and apply numbers and percentages to it. So now we can take sort of the general concept and then put some concrete numbers and percentages to it. So this is a way of looking at their transition probabilities from 2013 to 2014 and sort of the percentage of the number of employees they have in 2014. And so what they're looking at is for a particular job category, full-time customer service rep, right? That's the level in the company. And then you see the percent that are stayed as the full-time service rep between 2013 and 2014, the percent that went from full-time to part-time. So 10% of people went to a part-time job. Then 10% got promoted to a supervisor. And 0% got promoted from full-time service over the supervisory position into the managerial position. So there were none that did that. But there were 40% that left. So you would have to look at that and go, wow, 40% of our employees are leaving out of 400 and they're exiting the company entirely. That's a big percentage, and that's something you want to flag and look at. In terms of the other feeder position, for example, a part-time customer service rep. Again, it's a level 1 employee. These are both the feeder positions into the supervisory position. 20% went from the part-time to full-time. 50% stayed part-time. 5% moved up to supervisory. None, of course, jumped from part-time to manager. 25% exited. So less exited the part-time, but we need to figure out why are so many full-time people leaving. In terms of the supervisory position, this is the next level up. That's that target position we were talking about. 5% moved down, got demoted, if you will, to the full-time sales rep. 0% went part-time. So if they were full-time already as a supervisor, they stayed full-time if they went backwards down to a full-time customer service rep position. 85% stayed where they're at. That's great. So we don't see a lot of turnover or change there. And that might certainly be one of the reasons why those full-time customer service reps are leaving the company. If we're not seeing a lot of turnover at the supervisory level and people aren't leaving, there's no opportunities for them to grow in the company. 5% of those supervisors got promoted to managers and 5% exited. So this is a pretty good transition, but that number, 85% staying in that supervisor position, may give you an indication why 40% of your full-time sales reps or customer service reps are leaving, because only a handful will get promoted when opportunities arise, and maybe they want a position elsewhere that gives them the growth opportunities that they want. Lastly, we look at the highest level, the position that people can be promoted into, which is the managerial position. It's a level 3. No full-time or part-time reps, they didn't go down from manager to full-time or part-time reps. They didn't go down to supervisors. 65% stayed as managers. And then 35% left the company. And again, that's probably a sizable percentage that we want to look at. Why 35% left? Granted, there's only 20 managers in the company, but we probably want to explore why about a third of them left. Was it, better job opportunities, retirements? You name it. We need to figure it out. So you can see from the manager position, nobody got demoted at all. In fact, none of them moved backwards to the full-time, part-time, or supervisory positions. The biggest problem we have was a third of them, a little bit more than a third, left the company. And so we need to figure out why that is. So table 5.3 takes the percentages that we talked about in table 5.2 in the previous slide and gives you some concrete numbers to work with. So, for example, we said 40% of the full-time customer service reps stayed as full-time customer service reps. So 40% times 400 is 160. So that means that 160 of the 400 full-time customer service reps will stay as customer service reps. 40 of those 400, or 10%, will go to part-time. 10% will get promoted. And 160, which is, I believe, again, 40% there, will exit the company. So we're losing half as many as we are in essence keeping. And so we want to explore, obviously, that information. It's the same thing that proceeds all the way down. So at the end of 2014, we know we had 400 employees in the full-time position, 150 in the part-time, 75 supervisors, 20 managers. So our forecast for 2015 means that we're going to have, if we need 400, we have a deficit of 206 full-time customer service reps that we've got to address. So now what we're doing is we're taking the forecasting for 2015, how many are actually going to be in those positions at the end of 2014 / the beginning of 2015, and where can we expect to see deficits throughout 2015 that we're going to have to address. So, for example, we have a gap of 194 full-time people, right? We have a gap of 115 we have a gap of 35 part-time people. We have a gap of 206. I apologize I looked at the wrong number. So we will have 194. We'll have a deficit of 206. For part-timers, we'll have 115. We'll have a deficit of 35, assuming that the numbers that we will need stay the same. We will have 112 supervisors. We will have 37 more than we need. So if we have 37 supervisors more than we need, we may need to consider demoting some of those, moving them back to some of those sales positions, the full-time customer service positions. They may not like that, but that could be a concern for us, and so that's an opportunity where we can take some of where we have surplus, short of laying them off, moving them back to a full-time customer service rep position. In terms of managers, we're going to have a deficit of 3, so perhaps some of those 37 surplus that we have could be promoted to those managerial positions, and the remaining 34 supervisors could then be filtered back to a full-time customer service rep position, if they're willing to take that position. So again, we have to think about all sorts of factors, right? Why did we lose those 207, employees? And where are we at in terms of making sure we have the number of employees that we need to meet our demands? So we want to be careful of that. And again, this sort of assumes that the numbers stay fairly stable between what we had at 2014 and what we're going to need for 2015. We have a variety of different forecasting methods that we could use. We can use basic judgment, which is, in essence, the manager using their best estimate, best guesstimate on what to expect. And managerial judgment is completely fine, particularly with smaller, more stable businesses. You can use managerial judgment very easily to be able to make some forecasting decisions. But in a more volatile market, which most industries are in, or a more volatile job categories, for example, customer service, we may need to not rely only on judgment. We want to use replacement charts, transition charts, things like that. So how can we look at what tools do we use to develop our forecasting? Well, we judgment is one, as we talked about. We also want to look at talent inventories. And a talent inventory typically is where we keep track of the knowledge, skills, and abilities and other beneficial things that employees bring to the table and keep track of that. General competencies, general qualifications, certifications, you name it. So the talent inventory keeps track of that. And typically we use our learning, our inner knowledge system, our knowledge management system, our online human resource information system, and we utilize that to keep track of skill inventory. Employee surveys, we can survey them regularly about whether or not people are going to leave, if they where are their satisfactions, what are their concerns, and if you're doing a climate survey, for example, or a morale survey every year, and your morale starts to drop, that could be a concern. Labor market chain management, basically the basic foundation of any supply chain model is to have the right product, the right volume, the right place, the right time, with the right quality. So we need to think about the supply chain, where things are at, and make sure that we've got people in place all along the supply chains. So we want to make sure that we address and utilize our supply chain management tools like surveys and inventory management and planning and optimization, and apply that to people as well. So we can use software that can help us to deploy the right amount of people. And there's a huge research area in operations management about making sure we have enough people to deploy into appropriate positions. So this is a great example of a replacement chart. This is figure 5.5 in your textbook, and this shows you how you can use a replacement chart for succession planning. For example, if you want to promote people into the position of VP of HR, that's sort of the goal or the target position, you can look at the different people who would be naturally ready to move up to that next level of position. For example, on the far left, you've got the HR director for the Western region, Sam Jones. What are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? And whether or not that person is ready. So you can do a succession planning chart or a readiness chart to address this. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the in selecting and assessing internal candidates, right? Then we can look at Pat Wildstrom, the HR director for the Eastern region. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And are they ready for promotion? And this assessment basically says Pat is got a lot of good strengths and weaknesses, but probably needs more global experience to move up to the level of VP of HR. So that means in your development plan for Pat, you've got to be thinking about, in order for you to be ready for promotion, you need more skill in this area. So what can we do to give you the skills needed to be ready for promotion to the next level, if that's what you aspire to? Now, Pat may not aspire to go up higher. Pat may be perfectly happy where he or she is, but it is also possible that they do want to be promoted. And so you've got to be in conversation. This is where training and development and staffing go hand in hand. We've got to make sure that we're having a dialogue with Pat to know whether or not those are skills that Pat wants and whether or not the promotion is something that Pat seeks. If Pat's not interested in working in the global area and they're not interested in that VP position, I wouldn't worry about it so much. But if they are interested, then we've got to find a way to get Pat those experiences and those skills. For Sally, good strength in the international area, good performer. They need more experience with strategic planning. And again, same sort of situation. If Sally's ready for promotion and wants to be promoted, then we have to help Sally develop her strategic planning expertise. If she's not ready for promotion and doesn't want to go, the bottom line is You don't need to develop her if she doesn't want it. So if she wants it, work on it. If she doesn't want it, then you can keep her in the positions that she's at. So again, this is all part of that broader um, training and development dialogue that we need to have, and where we see that overlap between the training and development functions on the one hand and the staffing functions on the other hand. In terms of forecasting the labor market external to the organization, there's two tools that we can use. We can make our own observations and judgments by, our own experience of hiring people from the outside, or through monitoring labor market stats, generated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so we want to obviously, from a legal perspective, be aware of what qualified people are available in the labor market, because we want to make sure that we're using the appropriate percentage of available qualified people based on stock statistics. Make sure we're within our 4/5 rule, applying that to the stock of employees that we hire from. But also, it's helpful to get a good sense just from what we read in the newspapers and the local areas. What do we have that's available? I mean, a great example of this was Trek Bicycles a number of years ago. And I know I've used this example in other classes, but it really applies here as well. Trek Bicycle was trying to hire people in a really low unemployment market. It was about as close to zero unemployment as you could get in a really good economy, and they needed to hire really important skilled labor that just wasn't available in their local area. So in order to be able to forecast what was available to them, they needed to be aware of and broaden their view of what they considered to be their labor market. So local labor market wasn't working for them, so they needed to think a little bit more nationally and perhaps even globally to attract qualified workers to come work in small town in Wisconsin, right? So that's when they looked to, and they read in the news that Boeing was laying people off. So they knew that they were going to have the right kind of skilled labor being laid off of Boeing. And so they made the trek up to, to St. Louis and to Seattle. And I think they have a Boeing branch in LA as well. And to try to attract those engineers to come work for Trek. So when they were thinking about their labor market, the labor market stats would tell them there probably weren't enough qualified people in the area, or they may have had a very low percentage of unemployment in their area. So finding the skilled labor they wanted would not be enough. So they would need to use their observation and judgment to figure out where they could find those qualified people. Lastly, in this section, we're looking at how do we resolve that labor market supply and demand gap. So we have to come up with an action plan based on our judgment, based on the assessment of our internal labor market, based on the assessment of the external labor market. What is our plan for sourcing where to find the employees, or to identify where we have big gaps, so that our selection system that we're going to set up in terms of sourcing and recruiting employees and then hiring them is going to reflect some of the challenges that we may have in terms of the supply of employees that we need.